The year was 1887, and the sun had just begun its slow climb over the horizon. Spilling gold across the endless plains of the New Mexico territory, dust swirled gently in the morning breeze, the kind that carried with it the scent of mesquite and the faint crackle of a world not yet tamed. In that land where the law was still half-written and men carved out their lives with their bare hands, a lone ranch stood miles from the nearest town. Its wooden barn, weathered gray by sun and storm, creaked with the weight of silence. But on this morning, silence would not last long. Something, or rather, someone was about to turn that rancher's life upside down forever. He had never been the kind of man to seek out adventure. His life was one of cattle drives, mending fences, and long nights staring at the prairie sky. Yet, as fate often works in mysterious ways, adventure had found him all the same. Word had spread through the frontier of strange dealings with the Apache tribes, whispers of uneasy truces and old debts that had yet to be settled. Some men scoffed at the tales, others crossed themselves in nervous habit. The rancher, for his part, never thought those whispers would come riding to his door. But when he heard the heavy knock at his barn that morning, followed by the creak of its doors swinging wide, he knew life would never again be simple. The figure who stepped forward was a man of unmistakable authority. The Apache chief was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the weight of generations. His eagle feather headdress swayed gently in the breeze, and his eyes, dark and steady, locked onto the ranchers with a kind of knowing that left no room for argument. He didn't come with a war party or weapons raised. He came with a decision already made. Behind him were 3 women, 3 sisters like any the rancher had ever seen. They towered nearly a head and a half above him, their presence commanding even before a word was spoken. Each one carried herself with the quiet strength of someone born to the land. Yet there was something otherworldly about them, as though the earth itself had shaped them taller, stronger, more enduring than ordinary folk. The rancher's breath caught in his throat. His barn, which had once been nothing more than a shelter for horses and hay, now stood as the stage for something far larger than his own simple world. The chief's voice, deep and steady, broke the silence. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "You're going to be their husband," he said, his tone leaving no space for refusal. The words landed like the crack of a rifle shot, and the rancher felt the weight of them settle heavy on his chest. He glanced toward the sisters, their eyes steady, their expressions unreadable. They did not look shy or uncertain, but neither did they look cruel. They looked resolved, as if they too understood that their lives had been set on this course long before this moment. The rancher's heart raced. He had lived through cattle rustlers, droughts, the bitter chill of winter storms, but never had he faced anything like this. Marriage, 2-3 women at once, giant women at that, was something beyond his understanding. He wanted to speak, to protest, but the words tangled in his throat. The chief stood silent, waiting, as though the rancher's answer was less important than his acceptance of the truth. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and endless, as if daring him to run. Yet he knew there was no running from this. Not here. Not now. The sisters took a single step forward, their shadows falling over him like tall pines on a mountain slope. Their presence filled the barn, made it smaller somehow, as though the air itself bowed to them. The eldest, with her hair braided in long black ropes that glistened in the light, tilted her head ever so slightly, her gaze fixed on the rancher. The second, her expression softer, but no less steady, rested her hand on her hip, a small gesture that seemed to speak volumes. The youngest, eyes sharp as flint, studied him like a hawk sizing up prey. They did not speak, yet their silence pressed heavier than words ever could. The rancher's mind spun. Was this a test? A punishment? A gift? He had heard tales of men who crossed tribes and were made to pay debts in blood. He had also heard of alliances forged through marriage, though never like this. And never had he heard of women so striking, so impossibly tall and commanding. He wondered if the land itself had grown them that way, as guardians of something deeper than mere custom. The chief's expression gave away nothing. He simply waited, the quiet authority of his stance, as unmovable as the mountains to the west. The rancher swallowed hard. He wanted to ask why him, why now, why this burden? But another thought tugged at him, quieter, more dangerous. What if this wasn't a burden at all? What if this was destiny, written in a script older than any fence line or cattle brand? He had always lived a life of solitude, his only company, the lowing of cattle and the crackle of fire at night. Was it possible that the winds of fate had carried these women, these sisters, into his world for a reason beyond his understanding? And if so, what kind of man would he become in the shadow of their presence? Outside, the morning sun rose higher, painting the sky with streaks of fire. The land stirred with life crickets in the grass, distant hoofbeats echoing across the plains. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what he would say, what he would do. But before he could find words, the chief lifted his hand in quiet command. "It is decided," he said, voice steady as stone. The finality in those words struck harder than the first. The rancher realized, with a chill running through him, that this was not a request. It was an order, sealed by tradition, by power, by forces far greater than his own will. The sisters did not flinch. Their eyes remained locked on him, each one carrying a story he could not yet read. In that moment, the barn seemed to shrink, the world outside seemed to fade, until it was only them, the rancher, the chief, and the three giant sisters whose lives were now bound to his in a way he could neither control nor escape. The rancher's pulse thundered in his ears, and he knew that the life he had once known, the quiet solitude of a simple man, had ended with those words. What began in that barn would change not only his fate, but perhaps the fate of the land itself, and as the heavy barn doors groaned shut behind them, casting long shadows across the dirt floor, the rancher realized with a jolt that his story had only just begun. The barn doors shut with a low groan, and for a long moment the rancher could only hear the hollow sound of his own heartbeat. Dust drifted lazily through the air, catching the shafts of light that slipped in through the cracks of the wooden walls. The air seemed thicker somehow, heavier, as if the barn itself understood the weight of what had just taken place. He stood frozen, not daring to move or speak, while the three sisters and the Apache chief stood like carved statues, their presence filling every corner of the room. The chief's gaze did not waver. His words had been final, leaving no room for negotiation, but still the rancher's mind wrestled with questions. He wanted to know why he had been chosen, what debt or bargain had tied him to this fate. Yet something in the chief's eyes warned him that asking would not bring answers, not now. The silence stretched, and with each second, the rancher felt his world slipping further out of his own. Control, the sisters stood shoulder to shoulder, their tall frames making him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The eldest shifted slightly, her braids swaying across her shoulder. And though her face remained calm, there was a flicker in her eyes, something like recognition, or perhaps expectation. The second's gaze softened for only a breath, as if she had caught the uncertainty in him and pitied it. The youngest, however, kept her sharp stare fixed on him, her jaw set, as though daring him to resist. They were not girls to be courted in the usual way, nor women who would ever bow their heads in submission. They were forces of nature, and he had been thrust into their path. The chief finally broke the silence. "This land remembers promises," he said, his voice deep and even. "Some debts are paid in cattle, some in blood, and some in family." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the sisters. "They are strong as the earth is strong. They are yours, and you are theirs. The land has decided this." The rancher's mouth felt dry. He wanted to protest, to say he had never agreed to any such thing. But the weight in the chief's words told him that his own opinion mattered little here. He looked again at the sisters, trying to read them, but their expressions revealed nothing certain. What kind of life had shaped them into what they were? Why had they been brought here to him? And what did it mean that the land itself was said to have chosen? Outside, a hawk cried somewhere high above the plains, its voice sharp against the morning air. The sound seemed to cut through the barn, reminding the rancher of the wide world beyond those walls. Yet here he stood, surrounded by mysteries he could not unravel. The chief's presence was steady, but there was something unsettling in the way he seemed to know more than he let on. This was not a man who spoke idly. If he said the land had chosen, then there was more to this than mere arrangement or whim. The sisters began to move, their steps deliberate, boots pressing against the dirt floor with a weight that made the ground itself seem to shift. They did not speak, but the eldest gave him a long, searching look before turning her attention back to the chief. The second brushed her braid over her shoulder and glanced briefly at the barn door as if restless. The youngest's eyes never left him, sharp and unblinking, a constant reminder that he was under their watch. The chief stepped closer, lowering his voice so it carried with the gravity of a final instruction. You will not run. You will not send them away. You will learn. If you do not, the land will remember, and the land does not forgive. He let the words hang in the air like a warning carved into stone. Then, without waiting for reply, he turned and walked toward the doors. His movements were slow, deliberate, and as he pushed open the heavy wood, sunlight streamed in once again. For a moment, the rancher thought of calling after him, of demanding some explanation, but his voice failed him. The chief stepped out into the open, and within a few heartbeats, he was gone. The barn was quieter without him, yet somehow more suffocating. The rancher realized he was alone, now alone with 3 women he had never met before this morning. Women who had been handed to him not as companions, but as destiny. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, and his hands twitched at his sides, unsure whether to reach for his hat or to simply fold into himself. He knew cattle, he knew land, he knew how to mend a fence and ride through a storm. But this was something no man could be prepared for. The eldest sister finally stepped forward, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. Her voice was calm, even, but there was a strength beneath it that left no doubt she was used to being heard. You may not understand now, she said, but you will. What is done cannot be undone. Her words were simple, but their meaning cut deep. The second sister let out a slow breath, her eyes softening once more as if to balance the sternness of her elder. We are not here to break you, she said, her tone gentler. But neither are we here to be broken. The rancher caught himself staring, trying to read the sincerity in her face, but her gaze held steady. Neither kind nor cruel, simply certain. The youngest finally moved, stepping closer than the others. She was sharper, her eyes flashing with something that felt almost like challenge. You will learn fast, she said flatly, or you will be left behind. Her words were not a threat, but they carried the sting of one. And the rancher felt his chest tighten at the thought. He wanted to speak, to say anything that might steady the moment, but all he managed was a rough whisper. Why me? The words slipped out before he could stop them, hanging in the air like a plea. The sisters exchanged glances, but none of them answered. The silence that followed was heavier than before, and in it, he realized he would not be given the comfort of knowing not yet. The day stretched long after that, each moment slow and strange. The rancher moved about his land as he always did, feeding the horses, checking the fences, walking the pasture. But wherever he went, he felt their presence. The sisters lingered near the barn, sometimes stepping out into the sunlight, sometimes watching him from a distance. They did not speak much, but their silence was louder than words. Every glance reminded him of the truth he could not escape. By evening, the sky burned with streaks of orange and red, the kind of sunset that made the plains glow like fire. He sat by the barn, his hat pulled low, trying to steady his thoughts. The land stretched endless before him, quiet and vast, but it no longer felt like the same land he had known yesterday. It felt heavier, stranger, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The sisters stood together not far from him, their tall frames outlined against the fiery sky. They spoke in low voices he could not hear, their words carried away by the wind, but their presence was clear. They were not guests. They were not passing through. They were here to stay, and he was bound to them whether he willed it or not. Night settled over the plains, stars sharp and endless above. The rancher lay in his bed, but sleep would not come. He thought of the chief's words, of debts and promises older than himself. He thought of the sisters, their eyes steady, their silence unshakable. He thought of the land, and how it might hold secrets deeper than any man could know. and as the coyotes cried in the distance, he felt it settle into him. This was no accident, no mere chance. Something far greater had been set into motion. He turned onto his side, staring at the shadows across the wall. The barn loomed in his thoughts, the memory of the doors closing still fresh in his mind. The chief's voice echoed like thunder, "You're going to be their husband." And though he wished to deny it, to convince himself it was a dream or mistake, he knew it was neither. The land had chosen sleep, finally came in restless fragments, but the unease did not fade. Morning would come, and with it the unknown. He had stepped into a story not of his making, a story older than he could imagine. And as dawn crept closer, painting the horizon with pale light, he knew one thing for certain: his life was no longer his own. The land had bound him to the sisters, and whatever fate awaited, he would have to face it. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and confusion, a single question burned brighter than all the rest. Was this a punishment, or the beginning of something far more dangerous? The following days passed with a heaviness that the rancher could not shake. Life on the plains had always been simple chores that needed doing, cattle that needed tending, land that needed watching. But now, everything he did carried an edge of unease, as though each task was being judged not only by his own standards, but by the silent eyes of those who had been placed into his care. The sisters remained near, sometimes working alongside him in ways that surprised him, sometimes watching from a distance, always together. They moved with a quiet rhythm, as though they had lived on the land their whole lives, though he knew they had not. It unsettled him, the way they seemed to belong more than he did. The eldest sister was the first to show a sign of direction. One morning, before the sun had fully broken over the horizon, she was already outside, gathering water from the well with strength that made the wooden beam groan. Her movements were efficient, purposeful, and when the rancher came to take over, she met his eyes without flinching. "The land respects those who rise early," she said plainly, before lifting the bucket as though it weighed nothing. The rancher nodded, but her words stayed with him. She spoke not as a stranger trying to adjust to a new life, but as someone who already held claim to it. The second sister carried a quieter presence. She often lingered near the horses, running her hand along their manes, whispering words in a tongue he did not understand. Strangely, the animals calmed beneath her touch, even the restless bay that had never let anyone near without protest. The rancher watched from a distance one evening as she leaned her forehead against the horse's neck, her braid falling forward like a dark curtain. Something about the way she connected with the creatures stirred a feeling he could not name. She had a gift, or perhaps something more than a gift, though he dared not ask. The youngest, sharp, and restless, was different. She had little patience for silence or stillness. She prowled the edges of the land, scanning the horizon as though expecting threats to come at any moment. When he tried to speak with her, her answers were short, clipped, often carrying an edge that left him unsettled. "You don't look far enough," she told him once, when she caught him scanning the herd. "You see what is close, but not what waits beyond." She pointed toward the far hills, where the shadows gathered as the sun dipped low. "Trouble doesn't wait for you to notice." Her words stayed with him, carrying the same weight as the chief's warning at night. When the wind whistled low through the cracks of the house and the coyotes sang in the distance, the rancher lay awake, his mind tangled in questions. Why had the chief left them here? What debt was being paid? The land was wide and unforgiving, filled with dangers seen and unseen. Was he truly meant to be their husband? Or was that just a binding phrase, a mark of something deeper in alliance? A pact, a promise written in traditions older than he could grasp. The weight of it pressed down on him like the endless prairie sky. It wasn't only the sisters who occupied his thoughts. Word traveled fast on the frontier, carried by riders and whispers in saloons. By the third day, neighbors from miles off had already begun stopping by under flimsy excuses, looking for lost cattle, asking about supplies, pretending to offer help. But their eyes betrayed them. They had heard the stories, had seen the tall shadows moving on his land, and curiosity burned hotter than any friendly concern. The rancher knew talk would spread further, and with talk came danger. Out here, what people didn't understand, they feared. and what they feared, they often tried to destroy. One evening, a neighbor rode up on horseback, his voice gruff but laced with unease. "Heard tell you've got company at your place," he said, spitting into the dirt. "Strange company. Folks are saying all sorts of things." "That true?" The rancher forced a steady tone. "Company's my business, not theirs." But the man's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Strange things bring trouble," he muttered before riding off, leaving behind more questions than comfort. The sisters noticed too. The eldest watched the rider disappear, her expression unreadable. "They will not leave you alone," she said quietly. "The land holds stories, but men twist them. Be ready." The rancher felt a chill. He had known hardship before, but this was different. Trouble was not just drifting, and it was circling. The days stretched, and with them came new tensions. The sisters began to work more openly on the land, their height and strength impossible to ignore. They cut wood, hauled water, and moved through the fields with a presence that unsettled even the animals. The cattle shifted nervously when the youngest passed too close. The horses stood strangely still when the second whispered to them. The rancher tried to carry on as before, but everything about his life felt altered. He was not alone anymore, not in work, not in fate, not in the eyes of the neighbors who whispered his name like it carried scandal at night. By the fire, he tried to think of a way forward. The chief's words rang in his ears, "The land does not forgive." He wondered what debt had truly been laid at his feet. Was it a wrong his family had committed long before him? Was he simply a pawn in a story written by forces beyond his reach? And what did it mean to be tied not to one, but to three women who carried themselves with the strength of giants and the silence of mountains? The eldest began to teach him things he hadn't asked for. She showed him how to read the ground, how to see the trails of animals and the subtle signs of weather shifts. The second taught him how to calm the restless bay with nothing but her voice, a skill that felt like magic but she called patience. The youngest pushed him hardest, forcing him to track farther, to ride faster, to see danger where he once saw only horizon. He resisted at first, bristling at the intrusion into his life. But slowly he began to realize they were preparing him for something not yet revealed. The conflict burned inside him, growing sharper each day. He had not chosen this, and yet he could not turn away. The land itself seemed to conspire, shifting beneath his boots, reminding him that his life was no longer only his own. Each glance from the sisters carried weight, each word from them was a thread pulling him deeper into a story he had not agreed to. And yet, despite the unease, a part of him felt drawn to them, not just by their presence, but by the sense that they knew things he did not, that they carried secrets tied to the land, to the chief, to something far larger than himself. The neighbors' whispers grew louder. Men began gathering at the saloon, their words sharp with suspicion. Some said he had made a pact with the Apache. Others claimed the sisters were not human at all, but spirits giants cursed to walk the earth. The rancher heard these tales carried back to him by a passing hand, and though he knew them to be twisted by fear, he could not shake the feeling that there was some truth hidden in the rumors. The sisters were more than they seemed, and the land seemed to bend to their presence. One night, as the wind howled and the fire crackled low, the youngest came to him, her eyes fierce. "They're coming," she said, voice low but urgent. "Not tonight, but soon. Men who do not understand, men who will not listen. You must be ready." Her words struck like a hammer, and he felt his chest tighten. He thought of the neighbor's warning, of the whispers in the saloon, of the uneasy glances from those who rode past his land. Trouble was not just a distant possibility. It was drawing closer, step by step. The sisters did not speak of fear. They prepared quietly, sharpening tools, stacking wood, watching the horizon with unblinking eyes. The rancher tried to push down his doubts, but he knew they were right. The land carried debts, and men carried grudges, and somewhere between the two, he had been caught. The question that haunted him most was not whether conflict would come, but whether he would be ready when it did. And as the coyotes called across the plains that night, the rancher lay awake once more. Staring at the shadows flickering across his walls, he felt the weight of the chief's decision, the silence of the sisters, the rising storm of neighbors' suspicions. He was bound in a story larger than himself, and though he longed for answers, none had come. Only the heavy truth that the land remembers, and it was not finished with him yet. The rancher awoke before dawn. The sky still black, and the air cool with the weight of silence. He had grown used to the sounds of the land cattle shifting in the pasture, the faint rustle of the breeze through the grass, but now there was something else. A stillness. A waiting. It made the hair rise on the back of his neck. The chief's words came back to him, as they always did. The land remembers. He had tried to live with the sisters as best he could, but the unease around him had only grown. The neighbors were restless, and every whisper that reached his ears seemed sharper than the last. Trouble was circling, and he knew it would not circle forever. By the time the sun began its slow climb, painting the horizon in shades of pale gold, the sisters were already awake. The eldest was carrying a stack of firewood as though it weighed nothing. The second was by the horses again, her quiet murmurs keeping them calm. The youngest paced near the edge of the pasture, eyes fixed on the hills beyond. She looked like a sentinel, standing taller and fiercer than any fence or gate he could build. When she caught his eye, she stopped pacing and said, "They'll come soon." She didn't need to say who. The rancher swallowed the tightness in his throat. He knew she was right. The neighbors had been too curious, their visits too frequent, their eyes too suspicious. Men out here didn't like mysteries, and they liked being left out even less. The presence of 3 giant women Apache sisters, no less, was not something they would tolerate quietly. He wondered if they thought he had turned his back on them, sided with the tribe, or struck some secret bargain. Whatever they believed, it was dangerous. Fear made men reckless. That evening, he saw the first signs. Smoke curled in the distance where no ranch fire should have been. The sisters saw it too. The eldest narrowed her eyes, her face set in hard resolve. The second whispered something he could not hear, her hand tightening on the reins of the bay. The youngest's jaw clenched, and she muttered, "They test us." The rancher's chest ached with unease. He knew what it meant when men started setting fires just out of sight. It was a warning, and warnings were never the end. Days passed, each heavier than the last. He worked the land as always, but every sound carried suspicion. A branch cracking, a crow's cry, even the distant roll of thunder made him wonder if it was men coming. The sisters sensed it too, their vigilance growing sharper. The eldest rarely left his side, as if to make sure he did not falter. The second grew quieter, her eyes always watching the horizon. The youngest grew more restless, training him harder than ever, making him ride farther, making him track prints in the dust, making him see danger where once he would have seen only open land. One night, the tension broke. The rancher was woken by the sound of hoofbeats, too many too close. He rushed outside, his rifle in hand, and saw shadows moving near the barn. The sisters were already there, standing tall in the moonlight, their forms casting long, impossible shadows. The men didn't step forward, but he heard their voices. Low, angry, heavy with suspicion. "We know you're hiding something," one called out. Another spat into the dirt. "You think you can bring giants onto this land and not answer for it?" The rancher's heart hammered. He wanted to call back to reason with them, but the eldest sister raised her hand, stopping him. She stepped forward instead, her voice steady but commanding. "We are not hiding. We are here because the land willed it." Her words carried like thunder in the night, and the men muttered among themselves. They didn't understand, and he could tell they didn't care to. Fear had taken root, and once it did, words rarely tore it free. The men pulled back that night. But their retreat felt more like planning than surrender. The sisters remained at the barn until dawn, their eyes fixed on the horizon. When the rancher tried to speak, the youngest cut him off. "They'll be back. More of them. Next time, it won't be words." The rancher couldn't argue. He had seen it before, how men on the frontier handled what they couldn't control. He spent the next days preparing, patching fences, storing food, checking his rifle again and again. But deep down, he knew wood and steel would not be enough. The chief hadn't left the sisters with him for no reason. They were here because a storm was coming. one larger than a few suspicious neighbors. The land itself seemed to echo that truth. Storm clouds gathered where skies were usually clear. Coyotes circled closer to the house than ever before. Even the cattle grew restless, bunching together at the edges of the pasture. It was as if the earth was bracing for something. The eldest finally spoke of it one night as they sat by the fire. "This is not about us alone," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with certainty. "It is about the land, the promises broken, the debts unpaid. You are caught in it, because the land chose you. That cannot be undone." Her words sent a chill through him. He thought of his father, his grandfather, the men who had carved out their lives here before him. Had they made some pact long forgotten? Had he inherited a burden he never knew existed? The second sister added softly, "The men who come. They think this is only about you. They do not see the truth. That blindness will drive them to strike harder." She looked at him then, her gaze heavy but steady. "When the time comes, you cannot falter." The youngest, as always, spoke with fire. "They will test you. They will try to break you. If you fail not only us, but the land itself." Her words cut deep, sharper than any blade. The rancher could barely sleep after that. Each night he lay awake, waiting for hoofbeats, for fire, for the shouts of angry men. And each morning he rose with the sisters already watching the horizon. The air grew heavier, charged with the sense of something about to snap. The climax of it all came closer with each passing day. The neighbors no longer rode by with excuses. The smoke on the horizon grew thicker, closer. Tools disappeared from his barn, cattle spooked without reason, and once he found a bullet lodged in his fence post. They weren't hiding their intent anymore. They were letting him know the end was coming. The rancher stood one evening at the edge of his land, staring out at the wide expanse that had once felt endless and free. Now it felt like a battlefield, every hill and shadow holding the threat of men who wanted him gone. The sisters stood behind him, tall and unshaken, their presence both a comfort and a reminder of the weight he carried. He felt the conflict pressing from all sides, neighbors ready to strike. The land-holding debts he didn't understand, and the sisters, bound to him by a destiny he hadn't chosen. When the hoofbeats finally came again, louder and closer than before, the rancher knew this was it. He gripped his rifle, his palms slick with sweat, and turned toward the barn. The sisters were already there, their eyes hard, their stances steady. The eldest placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "It begins now." And as the sound of men filled the night, torches flickering on the horizon, the rancher felt the world tighten around him. The moment he had been dreading, the moment the chief had set in motion, was here. The land was calling its debt. There would be no turning back. The hoofbeats thundered closer, torches flickering across the hills like restless spirits. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle, though he knew it wasn't just steel that would decide this night. The sisters stood beside him, tall and steady, their shadows cast long across the dirt yard. The eldest placed a hand on his arm, her calm steadiness cutting through the storm, building inside him. "Stand," she said quietly. "The land watches." The men drew nearer, their horses stamping, their voices harsh in the dark. "Come out." One shouted, "No more hiding. You'll answer for bringing them here." Another called, "This is ranch country, not Apache ground. You want to keep giants here? You'll pay for it." Their words carried fear more than courage. But fear could spill blood faster than anything. The rancher stepped forward before he could lose his nerve. "I didn't bring them here," he shouted back, his voice shaking but loud enough to carry. "The land brought them. You think this is about me, but it's bigger than that." "You can't fight what the land has chosen," the men muttered. "It's uncertain, though." Their torches wavered like angry stars. The youngest sister moved past him then, her height towering over the firelight. Her voice cut through the noise. "You come with anger, but you do not see. You think it's danger because we are different? But the danger is not us. It is what waits if you strike against the land itself." Her words were sharp as flint. But the men only stirred louder. They could not see what she meant. One rider spurred forward, torch raised high. "We won't let you curse this place," he roared. And in that moment, the rancher felt the choice fall squarely on him. He could fire his rifle, he could plead again, or he could do nothing and let the men burn his world. But before he moved, the eldest sister lifted both arms. Her voice rang out, strong as thunder. The land remembers. A wind rose, sudden and fierce, tearing across the yard. Dust swirled, torches sputtered, and horses screamed. The men fought to hold their mounts as the storm swept in from nowhere, rattling the barn, bending the grass flat. The rancher shielded his eyes, his heart hammering. He had seen storms roll off the mountains before, but never one like this. It felt alive, answering her call. When the wind settled, the torches were out and the men were shaken. Some muttered prayers. Others cursed. The rider who had charged forward sat pale, his horse trembling beneath him. The sisters stood unmoved, tall and silent in the aftermath, like guardians carved from the earth itself. The rancher's voice broke the silence. "This isn't my doing," he said, softer now. "It isn't theirs either. It's the land. And you can't fight it." The men didn't answer right away. Fear lingered heavy in their eyes, but pride kept them from backing down openly. At last, one of the older riders spat into the dirt. "This isn't finished," he muttered, before tugging his reins and turning away. One by one, the others followed, their anger dimmed, but not gone. They disappeared into the night, leaving the ranch in uneasy silence once more. The rancher's knees nearly gave out from the weight of it. The rifle slipped from his hands, falling into the dirt. The eldest sister steadied him with one hand, her eyes firm. "This was only the beginning," she said. "But tonight," the land spoke, and they heard. He nodded weakly, though his chest felt hollow. He knew she was right. The men had left, but not because they understood. They would whisper, they would plan, and their fear would not vanish overnight. In the days that followed, the rancher worked harder than ever. He fixed the fences, tended the cattle, and repaired the damage where the storm had torn shingles loose from the barn. The sisters worked alongside him, never speaking of what had happened. But their presence carried its own message. He was not alone. The eldest watched the horizon more often, as though waiting for another test. The second soothed the animals, who had grown restless from the night's turmoil. The youngest pressed him harder in their rides and drills, her sharp words hiding what might have been care. But something had changed inside him. For the first time, he began to see them not as strangers thrust upon him, but as part of the land itself, woven into its fabric, tied to its strength. The chief had not given him a burden. He had given him a bond, one he had been too blind to see. The whispers in the town never stopped. Some said he had made a deal with the Apache. Others claimed he had taken witches into his barn. But none dared ride out again. The storm that had risen at the sisters' call had left its mark. Fear could twist into anger, but it could also keep men at bay. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the rancher sat outside, watching the cattle graze. The eldest sister joined him, her long shadow stretching across the yard. "You still question why?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Every day. But I'm starting to see it isn't about me knowing why. It's about me standing when the land asks me to." She gave the faintest nod, her eyes on the fading sky. "That is enough." The second sister came then, leading the restless bay, her voice soothing as always. "The land is not cruel," she said. "It does not choose without reason." He met her gaze, and for the first time he felt the truth in her words. The youngest lingered near the barn, watching him with her hawk-like eyes. When their gazes met, she gave a sharp nod. "You did not break," she said. It was the closest thing to praise he had heard from her. Strangely, it steadied him more than anything else. The rancher realized then that his life had shifted forever. He was no longer the solitary man he had once been, living only for cattle and sky. He was part of something larger, bound not just to the sisters, but to the land itself. The chief's words came back with new weight. "You're going to be their husband." He had thought it a sentence. Now he began to see it as a calling. The months rolled on, and though the neighbors still whispered, they did not return. The sisters remained, their strength becoming part of the daily rhythm of the ranch. The land seemed steadier somehow, as though satisfied that its debt had been acknowledged. The rancher worked as he always had, but he did so with the knowledge that his life was tied to something far older and greater than himself. On the final night of summer, as the stars burned bright above, he stood outside the barn and listened to the quiet. The sisters stood near, their tall frames outlined by moonlight. For the first time since they had arrived, he felt no fear, no resistance, only a strange peace. He thought of the men who would never understand, of the whispers that would never die, of the weight of the land that would always rest on his shoulders. And yet, he also thought of the bond that had been forged, the strength that had carried him through, the truth that had been revealed. The land remembered, yes, but so would he. And as the prairie wind carried the night across the plains, the rancher knew the story was no longer about debts or fear. It was about standing when called, about belonging to something larger, about learning that sometimes the land chose not to punish but to bind. He glanced once more at the sisters, their steady presence as constant as the earth itself, and for the first time he felt no doubt at all. The land had chosen, and he was ready to carry it.